Hello. It's kind of funny story yesterday. My daughter was like, "Mommy, what's that thing on your forehead?" I'm like, "It's just a pimple. Like, I have bangs that mostly cover stuff like that up, so..." Why is this not working? There we go. Okay, we are saving. We are opening in. It used to be I would tap the button and it would like automatically open up. Like pages would be like one of the first options. So I don't know why it's not anymore. It's kind of weird. Also, I'm pretty sure I am getting a cold. So my throat's kind of bleh. It just feels gunky. It happens. It's the reality of life. People get sick. My daughter had, quite honestly, we thought it was strep a couple weeks ago, but we had her tested for strep and it was not strep and it was not the flu. So I don't know what it is. So my voice may not be the best this morning. Yesterday it was like this in the morning and then it kind of cleared up by time to record. Today's a Friday for me, so it's my last recording day of the week. I have like a little bit that I do on the weekends, but not nearly what I do Monday through Friday. Today we'll be continuing Rainbow Valley by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Chapter 7, A Fishy Episode. Rilla Blythe walked proudly, and perhaps a little primly through the main street of the glen, and up the manse hill, carefully carrying a small basket full of early strawberries, which Susan had coaxed into lusciousness in one of the sunny nooks of Ingleside. Susan had charged Rilla to give the basket to nobody except Aunt Martha or Mr. Meredith, and Rilla, very proudly of being entrusted with such an errand, was resolved to carry out her instructions to the letter. Susan had dressed her daintily in a white starched and embroidered dress, with a sash of blue and beaded slippers. Her long ruddy curls were sleek and round, and Susan had let her put on her best hat, out of compliment to the manse. It was a somewhat elaborate affair, wherein Susan's taste had had more to say than Anne's, and Rilla's small soul gloried in its splendors of silk and lace and flowers. She was very conscious of her hat, and I'm afraid she strutted up the manse hill. The strut, or the hat, or both got on the nerves of Mary Vance, who was swinging on the lawn gate. Mary's temper was somewhat ruffled just then. Into the bargain. Aunt Martha had refused to let her peel the potatoes and had ordered her out of the kitchen. Mary. Yeah, you'll bring the potatoes to the table with strips of skin hanging to them and half boiled as usual. My, but it'll be nice to go to your funeral, shrieked Mary. She went out of the kitchen, giving the door such a bang that even Aunt Martha heard it, and Mr. Meredith in his study felt the vibration and thought absently that there must have been a slight earthquake shock. Then he went on with his sermon. Mary slipped from the gate and confronted the spick-and-span damsel of Ingleside. "What you got there?" she demanded, trying to take the basket. Ow. Ow! Jim, Walter, Susan. I don't guess Rilla has talked yet. Diana, Jem, Nan, Walter, Susan. hold on. I'm going to search for, in the text, find Rilla. Rilla was curled up. It's chapter 30. Let's go to the first mention of it. Marilla. Okay, so she's 6, and she talks with a lisp. Okay. She hasn't talked yet. Chapter 7, she hasn't talked yet. Okay. Trying to take the basket. Rilla resisted. "It's for Mr. Meredith," she lisped. Now I'm pretty sure the last book is hers, like Rilla's. I'm pretty sure the last book is about Rilla. "Give it to me. I'll give it to him," said Mary. "No, Susan said that I wasn't to give it to anybody but Mr. Meredith or Aunt Martha," insisted Rilla. Mary eyed her sourly. "You think you're something, don't you? All dressed up like a doll. Look at me. My dress is all rags and I don't care. I'd rather be ragged than a doll baby. Go home and tell them to put you in a glass case. Look at me, look at me, look at me." Mary executed a wild dance around the dismayed and bewildered Rilla, flirting her ragged skirt and vociferating. Flirting her ragged skirt and vociferating, "Look at me, until poor Rilla was dizzy. But as the latter tried to edge away towards the gate, Mary pounced on her again. "You give me that basket," she ordered with a grimace. Mary was past mistress in the art of making faces. She could give her countenance a most grotesque and unearthly appearance out of which her strange, brilliant white eyes gleamed with weird effect. "I won't," gasped Rilla, frightened but staunch. "You let me go, Mary Vance." Mary let go for a minute and looked around her. Just inside the gate was a small flake on which 6 large codfish were drying. One of Mr. Meredith's parishioners had presented him with them one day, perhaps in lieu of the subscription he was supposed to pay to the stipend and never did. Mr. Meredith had thanked him and then forgotten all about the fish, which would have promptly spoiled had not the indefatigable Mary prepared them for drying and rigged up the flake herself on which to dry them. Mary had a diabolical inspiration. She flew to the flake and seized the largest fish there, a huge, flat thing, nearly as big as herself. With a whoop, she swooped down on the terrified Rilla, brandishing her weird missile. Rilla's courage gave way. To be lambasted with a dried codfish was such an unheard of thing that Rilla could not face it. With a shriek, she dropped her basket and fled. The beautiful berries, which Susan had so tenderly selected for the minister, rolled in a rosy torrent over the dusty road and were trodden on by the flying feet of pursuer and pursued. The basket and contents were no longer in Mary's mind. She thought only of the delight of giving Rilla Blythe the scare of her life. She would teach her to come giving herself airs because of her fine clothes. Rilla flew down the hill and along the street. Terror lent wings to her feet, and she just managed to keep ahead of Mary, who was somewhat hampered by her own laughter, but who had breath enough to give occasional blood-curdling whoops as she ran, flourishing her codfish in the air. Through the Glen street they swept, while everybody ran to the windows and gates to see them. Mary felt she was making a tremendous sensation and enjoyed it. Rilla, blind with terror and spent of breath, felt that she could run no longer. In another instant, that terrible girl would be on her with the codfish. At this point, the poor mite stumbled and fell into the mud puddle at the end of the street, just as Miss Cornelia came out of Carter Flagg's store. Miss Cornelia took the whole situation in at a glance. So did Mary. The latter stopped short in her mad career, and before Miss Cornelia could speak, she had whirled around and was running up as fast as she had run down. Miss Cornelia's lips tightened ominously, but she knew it was no use to think of chasing her, so she picked up poor, sobbing, disheveled Rilla instead and took her home. Rilla was heartbroken. Her dress and slippers and hat were ruined, and her 6-year-old pride had received terrible bruises. Susan, white with indignation, heard Miss Cornelia's story of Mary Vance's exploit. "Oh, the hussy. Oh, the little hussy," she said, as she carried Rilla away for purification and comfort. "This thing has gone far enough, Anne dearie," said Miss Cornelia resolutely. "Something must be done. Who—" Make sure I've got their voices right. Susan. Very poorly. Go listen to Susan again. Cornelia's is fine. Very poorly. Oh, the hussy. Oh, the little hussy, she said, as she carried Rilla away for purification and comfort. "This thing has gone far enough, Anne dearie," said Miss Cornelia resolutely. "Something must be done. Who is this creature who's staying at the manse, and where does she come from?" I understood she was a little girl from over harbor who was visiting at the manse, answered Anne, who saw the comical side of the codfish chase and secretly thought Rilla was rather vain and needed a lesson or two. "I know all the over-harbor families who come to our church, and that imp doesn't belong to any of them," retorted Miss Cornelia. "She's almost in rags, and when she goes to church she wears Faith Meredith's old clothes. There's some mystery here, and I'm going to investigate it since it seems nobody else will. I believe she was at the bottom of their goings-on in Warren Mead. Dang it. I believe she was at the bottom of their goings-on in Warren Mead's spruce bush the other day. Did you hear of their frightening his mother into a fit?" "No, I knew Gilbert had been called to see her, but I did not hear what the trouble was." "Well, you know she has a weak heart, and one day last week when she was all alone on the veranda she heard the most awful shrieks of murder and help coming from the bush. Positively frightful. Excuse me. Positively frightful sounds, Anne dearie. Her heart gave out at once. Warren heard them himself at the barn and went straight to the bush to investigate, and there he found all the manse children sitting on a fallen tree and screaming murder at the top of their lungs. They told him they were only in fun and didn't think anyone would hear them. They were just playing Indian ambush. Warren went back to the house and found his poor mother unconscious on the veranda." Susan, who had returned, sniffed contemptuously. "I think she was very far from being unconscious, Mrs. Marshall. No. I think she was very far from being unconscious, Mrs. Marshall Elliott, and that you may tie to. I've been hearing of Amelia Warren's weak heart for 40 years. She had it when she was 20. She enjoys making a fuss and having the doctor, and any excuse will do." "I don't think Gilbert thought her attack very serious," said Anne. "Oh, that may very well be," said Miss Cornelia, "but the matter's made an awful lot of talk, and the Meads being Methodists makes it that much worse. What is going to become of those children? Sometimes I can't sleep at night for thinking about them, Anne dearie. I really do question if they get enough to eat. Even for their father is so lost in dreams that he doesn't often remember he has a stomach, and that lazy old woman doesn't bother cooking what she ought. They're just running wild, and now that school is closing, they'll be worse than ever." "They do have jolly times," said Anne, laughing over the recollections of some Rainbow Valley happenings that had come to her ears. "And they are all brave and frank and loyal and truthful." "That's a true word, Anne dearie. And when you come to think of all the trouble in the church those two tattling, deceitful youngsters of the last ministers made, I'm inclined to overlook a good deal in the Merediths." "When all is said and done, Mrs. Doctor dear, they are very nice children," said Susan. "They have got plenty of original sin in them, and that I will admit. But maybe it is just as well, for if they had not, they might spoil from over-sweetness. Only I do think it is not proper for them to play in a graveyard, and that I will maintain." "But they really play quite quietly there," excused Anne. "They don't run and yell as they do elsewhere. Such howls as drift up here from Rainbow Valley sometimes, though I fancy my own small fry bear a valiant part in them. They had a sham battle there last night and had to roar themselves, because they had no artillery to do it. So Jem says. Jem is passing through the stage where all boys hanker to be soldiers." "Well, thank goodness he'll never be a soldier," said Miss Cornelia. "I never approved of our boys going to that South African fracas. But it's over, and not likely anything of the kind will ever happen again. I think the world is getting more sensible. As for the Merediths, I've said many a time, and I say it again, if Mr. Meredith had a wife, all would be well." "He called twice at the Kirks last week, so I'm told," said Susan. "Well," said Miss Cornelia thoughtfully, "as a rule I don't approve of a minister marrying in his congregation. It generally spoils him. But in this case it would do no harm, for everyone likes Elizabeth Kirk, and nobody else is hankering for the job of stepmothering those youngsters. Even the Hill girls balk at that. They haven't been found laying traps for Mr. Meredith. Elizabeth would make him a good wife if he only thought so. But the trouble is, she really is homely. And Anne dearie, Mr. Meredith, abstracted as he is, has an eye for a good-looking woman, manlike. He isn't so worldly when it comes to that, believe me." "Elizabeth Kirk is a very nice person, but they do say that people have nearly frozen to death in her mother's spare-room bed before now, Mrs. Doctor dear." "Need to swallow," said Susan darkly. "If I felt I had any right to express an opinion concerning such a solemn matter as a minister's marriage, I would say that I think Elizabeth's cousin Sarah over harbor would make Mr. Meredith a better wife." "Why, Sarah Kirk is a Methodist," said Miss Cornelia, much as if Susan had suggested a Hottentot as a man's bride. "She would likely turn Presbyterian if she married Mr. Meredith," retorted Susan. Miss Cornelia shook her head. Evidently with her it was. Once a Methodist, always a Methodist. "Susan Kirk is entirely out of the question," she said positively, "and so is Emmeline Drew, though the Drews are all trying to make the match. They are literally throwing poor Emmeline at his head, and he doesn't have... They're literally throwing poor Emmeline at his head, and he hasn't the least idea of it." "Emmeline Drew has no gumption, I must allow," said Susan. "She's the kind of woman, Mrs. Doctor dear, who would put a hot water bottle in your bed on a dog night, and then have her feelings hurt because you were not grateful. And her mother was a very poor housekeeper. Did you ever hear the story of her dishcloth? She lost her dishcloth one day, but the next day she found it. Oh, yes, Mrs. Doctor dear, she found it in the goose at the dinner table, mixed up with the stuffing. Do you think a woman like that would do for a minister's mother-in-law? I do not. But no doubt I would be better employed in mending little Jim's trousers than in talking gossip about my neighbors. He tore them something scandalous last night in Rainbow Valley." "Where is Walter?" asked Anne. "He is up to no good, I fear, Mrs. Doctor dear. He is in the attic writing something in an exercise book, and he's not done as well in arithmetic this term as he should, so the teacher tells me. Too well I know the reason why. He's been writing silly rhymes when he should have been doing his sums. I'm afraid that boy's going to be a poet, Mrs. Doctor dear." "He is a poet now, Susan." "Well, you take it real calm, Mrs. Doctor dear. I suppose it is the best way when a person has the strength. I had an uncle who began by being a poet and ended up being a tramp. Our family were dreadfully ashamed of him." "You don't seem to think very highly of poets, Susan," said Anne, laughing. "Who does, Mrs. Doctor dear?" asked Susan in genuine astonishment. "What about Milton and Shakespeare, and the poets of the Bible? They tell me Milton could not get along with his wife, and Shakespeare was no more than respectable by times. As for the Bible, of course things were different in those sacred days, although I never had a high opinion of King David. Say what you will, I never knew any good to come of writing poetry, and I hope and pray that blessed boy will outgrow the tendency. If he does not, we must see what emulsion of cod liver oil will do." Thank you for joining Bite at a Time Books today, while we read a bite of one of your favorite classics. Again, my name is Bree Carlisle, and I hope you come back tomorrow for the next bite of Rainbow Valley. There's an airplane or something overhead. I accidentally hit the undo button, and it deleted that last chapter. Not the whole chapter, like the last audio section. Make sure that goes. Okay, yeah, it definitely has it. Okay, back to the beginning. Go into chapter 8. Thanks, guys.